Do you know how meek I am?
Yeah.
Do you know how humble I am? Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks podcast. This is episode 10. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. This is, I guess it marks an occasion, right? This is our 10th episode.
Hey, it's a magic number.
We've made it this far. It's pretty exciting. So I just want to give a shout out to your mom. That sounds like a joke, but it's not. No.
What are you trying to say, man?
Your mom has been promoting the show. I had a bunch of people reach out and they said, yeah, we were talking to Nancy and she gave us this recommendation about this show. And way to go, Nancy.
We knew from the beginning Mom would be an avid listener eventually once I got around to telling her about it, and evidently a promoter. So that's good.
Yeah.
In fact, I've gotten a lot of good feedback and really appreciate everyone who's reached out to us to encourage us, everyone who's given some thoughts on topics and questions and things they'd like to hear more about. And that's been really cool. So thank you. Keep it coming. Let us know what you guys would like to hear about, and we'll keep doing this.
Yep. So I have freed myself from the temptation of ice cream. I am now back home in Phoenix.
Survived.
It was challenging, man.
That's really, you know, what's so rough is being in San Diego and eating ice cream. That is.
I took one for the team for sure. It was tough. All right, so let's get into our Jesus Said segment for this week. You've got a verse for me, right?
I do.
All right.
A short one, hopefully not too obvious. It's, I think, just so great, so powerful that I had to go with it. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Talk to me about the meek and inheriting the earth. That was Matthew 5:5, by the way.
Yes. I had a feeling you might pick this one because we didn't announce it, but our topic this week is on gentleness. We're continuing with our Fruit of the Spirit series, and meekness is tied very closely to gentleness. Even the word itself in the Greek is actually here translated as meekness, but later on in Matthew is translated as gentleness. But being kind and being gentle and being humble is a really, really good thing. Obviously, that's what he's saying here. Blessed are those who are gentle and kind and humble and tolerant, for they shall inherit the earth.
Why do you think they're going to inherit the earth?
It's kind of the same idea as the first shall be last and the last shall be first, in my mind.
Yeah.
You're going to get everything that the earth has. You're going to get everything that exists if you don't put yourself first, if you put the needs of others first.
Jesus is quoting a psalm here. It seems to me that these verses sort of inform what Jesus is saying about being meek. So it says in verse 3 of Psalm 37, trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Verse 9, for the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. Verse 11, but the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. So that's the verse Jesus is quoting. Verse 22, for those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land, but those cursed by him shall be cut off. Verse 29, the righteous shall inherit the land and dwell upon it forever. And verse 34, wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. You will look on when the wicked are cut off. So isn't that interesting that he's grabbing on to this verse and putting it into this statement of the kind of upside down blessedness of kingdom living and kingdom virtue and how surprising that is. And he pulls that from the context of this Psalm of David. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, what did you take from those verses? Anything jump out at you?
Well, again, that kind of contrast between the wicked and the violent and the evildoer. Mm-hmm. They're striving for control. Mm-hmm. That's what they want. They want control. They want to take over. They want to dominate. And they feel like they can conquer the earth in their ability to dominate. But the opposite is actually true. It's the one who doesn't want to dominate, who wants to be the opposite of that. Really, I feel like meekness and gentleness and humility here is kind of the opposite of this violent, domineering kind of character.
It makes me think of Aikido. You take the force of those who are coming against you and you turn it against them.
Right.
And so there's this tranquil strength. In fact, that's maybe how I would define meekness. It's a very weird Greek word. This power that has, as you said, this gentleness in it. And so here's all these people just basically killing each other off and beating each other down in their force and their violence and their evil. And the ones left to inherit the land are the meek, are the ones who wait on the Lord, are the ones who are full of goodness and befriend faithfulness and that kind of thing. And seeking, instead of taking what they want, they are receiving what the Lord gives with gratitude and joy as a blessing.
All right. So let's continue on in our series, Poetry in Motion. So let's get into Psalm 3. I guess we're just walking our way through the Psalms now.
Yeah.
We did 1, we did 2, now let's do 3.
Well, we have 150 episodes planned already. The layout's done.
Yeah. Some of those are going to be big.
No, we can do 119 in one episode. That'll be fine.
I'm sure. All right. So let's break up Psalm 3 into a couple of verses apiece, and let's go through it and talk through it together. I'll read verses 1 and 2. A psalm of David, this is the superscription. A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. So there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the superscriptions? How do you feel about these, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son? There's a lot of debate about whether or not they were actually original or whether they were inserted later.
I don't think David wrote a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. I think that the compiler added it, but it gives a nice background to help us to understand and connect this with a story. And I have no reason to believe that this wasn't at that time.
Yeah. So this is also one of the first times we see not only a superscription in the Psalms, but this is the first time we see the word Selah in the Psalms. And it's used here 3 times. And we understand the word Selah to be a musical notation. Whether or not that's 100% accurate is debated also. It would appear like this word indicated some sort of a pause in singing through these Psalms. So at the end of the first 2 verses, it says Selah. And it's this time of pause in the song. And whenever you sing a song and there's a moment of quiet, it just kind of hangs in the air and it adds another layer of depth to the whole song and to the words that you're saying.
Yeah, you pause and reflect on what has just been said.
Yes.
Very powerful.
And so here we see this being used, and there's good reason for it, because he says, O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. And there's a pause. He's obviously going through a lot right now. He has a lot of enemies. He has many against him. But this is about the time where the people as a whole are starting to turn against him.
Yeah, led by his own beloved son.
Yes.
Opposing him and kicking him out of the holy city.
And not only are they ridiculing him, but they're also, in a sense, speaking against God. God is not with him. God is not going to save him. And it seems, even as David leaves, he's met by a lot of opposition on the road, and people are hurling insults at him and all kinds of things. And he just kind of has to say, yeah, I deserve this.
Yeah, it's a sad picture.
It is. We see him here, especially as this musical notation might indicate, we see him really taking pause. And I think that's useful. Anytime we go through stuff, anytime we're experiencing trial or trouble or difficulty in our life, I always find it really helpful just to take a pause, to stop and think. Because it can be so easy to get wrapped up in these things, to just spin yourself out of control and thinking about all of the terrible things that are happening. But just take a pause.
Yeah, the psalm we just referenced in the meek will inherit the land says, be still.
Yes.
And this is not a pleasant thought to think about. There is no salvation for him in God, and that just sits with you.
Yeah.
But from there, he says, here's my answer. Or more specifically, here's your answer. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. You, O Lord, are a shield about me. And whenever he uses this phrase, about me, this is the same word that is used in Job 1:10 whenever Satan says to God, have you not put a hedge around him or about him and his house and all that he has on every side? In other words, Satan's accusation against Job is that God is protecting him from every bad thing, and that's why he's serving him. Well, David is glorying in this protection from God. You're a shield about me. And then he uses the word glory. You are my glory. This protection, this right and privilege to be your servant is glorious.
If in fact this is a psalm after David is running from Absalom, he has just gotten himself into a big mess with God. He is having to stand before God with his sin with Bathsheba and his sin with her husband and all the things that happened as a result of his mistakes, his poor choices, his lack of self-control, as we talked about last week.
Yeah.
He's having to stand before God with his hat in his hand and say, I am sorry, I have sinned against you, O Lord. But he doesn't view God as having abandoned him.
In 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 30, as he's leaving Jerusalem so that Absalom can take it over and he's running away, it says, but David went up the ascent of Mount Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up weeping as they went. So here's his head hanging low, covered. He's barefoot. And he's just crying, just tears streaming down his eyes as he's walking away from the holy city, from his throne. And here it says, unlike the head hanging low that was happening as he's walking out, he says, you are the one that lifts my head up. You're the one who keeps my head held high, because not of my glory as king, but your glory as king. Yeah. And he says, I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. And he knows that it's not Absalom's throne. It's not his throne. It's God who reigns from Jerusalem, from Mount Zion, and God who will answer his cry and bring his great royal will about. Selah.
And I think it just shows that he has faith. He still trusts God. He still believes that God is going to do what he said he was going to do, that God, in his faithfulness, is not going to leave him. And so that faith, I think, is another reason why he takes a pause here. This is a perfect time to just think about how trustworthy and faithful God is. And then out of that faith, out of that belief and trust in God, he turns to joy. So the rest of the psalm is really focused on joy. And so he says in verse 5, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. So whereas in the first few verses, he's noting all of these people who are against him, now he says, I can sleep well at night because I know the Lord takes care of me. He sustains me. And he's not going to be afraid of all of these people. He's not going to be afraid of many thousands of people because he still trusts in God. He still believes that God is with him. It actually reminds me on the opposite side when you see Peter and his interaction with Jesus on the water. When in Matthew 14, verse 29, where Jesus says, come, and Peter gets out of the boat, he walks on the water, he comes to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Here's Peter surrounded by the winds and the waves and the sea and everything, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he begins to sink. And Jesus points out to him, it was your lack of faith and your doubting that caused this to happen.
Yeah.
And here we see with David, he does not do that. All the trouble, all the trial around him, the storms of his life, he doesn't take his eyes off God.
He's more like Jesus sitting in the boat in another instance of a storm.
Yeah, sleeping.
Sleeping.
Yeah.
Sleeping through the storms that are all around him because God is in control of it. And we have a part to play, but he gives his beloved rest.
Yeah.
So that passage continues. There's not a Selah at the end of 5 and 6, so I think we're to view verses 7 and 8 with 5 and 6. This, I lay down and slept. God's protecting me from all those around me. And then a prayer. Arise, O Lord. Save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. God's judgment is not bad news. It is part of the gospel. It is good news. Just like it is for David in this psalm, it is good news when the Lord comes in judgment. And that's hard for us to get our minds around just from the sense that we recognize that we deserve, as sinners, God's wrath.
Sure.
And we, like God, we want everyone to come to repentance. But imagine if there wasn't a justice system in this country. What would happen?
Yeah.
That is the kind of world that it often seems like we're living in, but we recognize the value that David saw in God having judgment, and he expects nothing more from God than what he believes God expects of him as the king who has to rule Israel justly, who has to make sure that if someone is opposing God, is oppressing the fatherless and the orphan, is doing some wicked thing, they have to be met with just consequences. Someday, and David often has this kind of eschatological picture that he's painting in the Psalms, knowing that someday everything will be made right. Every wrong that hasn't been repented of will be met with its right consequence, and the wicked will no longer be in God's kingdom, in the new heavens and the new earth, to oppress us. Instead, only those who have chosen enough with that wickedness, I'm going to, with all of my strength, strive to hold up the right way, and those will be in the kingdom, in the new heavens and new earth, where righteousness lives.
Yeah.
2 Peter 3 says.
So let's transition now to talking about the fruit of the Spirit and continuing our conversation that we started last week. And as we mentioned, we're going through the fruit of the Spirit in the reverse order, working toward the climax. We dealt with self-control last week, and now we're going to talk about gentleness. Let's start off talking, because I think this psalm in Psalm 3 gives you this picture that God is a shield. He cares for David. He's taking care of David. But then at the same time, he's going to break the teeth of his enemies. And so I think it's important for us to see that all of these fruit of the Spirit, these are all characteristics, first and foremost, of God himself.
Yeah.
God is all of these things. Jesus is all of these things. And we see that in Isaiah 40 and verse 11. Also, we see it throughout the Psalms plenty of times. But in Isaiah 40 and verse 11, it says, "He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those who are with young." In the Old Testament, I think we walk away sometimes feeling like God is a wrathful and avenging God. And he definitely is. I mean, we do see that plenty of times. But at the same time, God is gentle. He's caring. He's meek, in a sense. He's taking care of, and he's showing kindness to his people, those who are his. And you get this sense here that that's how he's always been. And that's also what is said of Jesus in Matthew 11. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart." That word gentle there is the same word used in Matthew 5, translated meekness.
Yeah, and both come from his love. God is love.
Right.
It's one of the few things that God is described as not just an attribute. There's an equal sign between God and love. They are the same. God is the essence of love, and love is the essence of God. So both his wrath and his gentleness come from that love. God is the perfect leader. Jesus is the perfect king. He is the one who brings wrath and anger in the temple on all of these people who are cheating the poor, who just want to offer sacrifices to God. And he's using a whip and he's throwing over tables. And then he's declaring judgment that's going to come on Jerusalem later, a few decades later, because of this evil that's there. And that's who Jesus is, and that's who God is. And that is actually what meekness is. This is kind of an interesting thing we don't fully see in the word gentleness or the word meekness. William Barclay calls this word, prautes, the most untranslatable of all Greek words.
You can see that for sure.
Yeah, so we were able to go through the last episode on self-control the whole time without bringing up the Greek, but we have to bring up the original here because it's such a complex and interesting and important word. This virtue is so beautiful and powerful. And so a starting point might be to look at how Aristotle used the word. And it's something we don't bring up very often in Bible study, but here's a guy whose first language is Greek, and he's explaining virtues, and he loved to point out the center point of virtue and put it between two extremes and say it's the moderate point between these two wrong things. And meekness, prautes, is the midpoint that is neither a lack of anger or an excess of anger. And so if you think of, a situation where you flew off the handle, you were uncontrolled in your anger, or you were angry about the wrong things, you weren't just angry because God is being opposed, because someone's being oppressed, or there's wickedness, or there's some injustice, that you're just angry because you didn't get your way. That's not gentleness.
Right.
And being uncontrolled, that's not gentleness. That's not meekness. On the other hand, if you think of a situation where these evil things are happening, or I think of a situation where, for instance, my kids are disobeying me or hurting each other or putting themselves in danger, I might appropriately be angry at that and not fly off the handle and not be inappropriate in my response. I might control myself and yet have a sense of backbone and a sense of strength that comes from this righteous anger that says, look, you don't hurt each other. Look, I'm trying to look out for you. I don't want you to run out into the street again. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
And they need to hear that. And God expresses, and Jesus expresses that kind of anger to us against evil while showing gentleness constantly.
I think the point that you're making, which I think is a really, really important point to draw out here, is that gentleness, meekness, is not pacifist. It's not just like, oh, whatever happens, I don't care. Or it's not even remotely just sunny day, everything is always positive, bubble gum and raindrops. It's not that.
No.
Because there is a requirement for the other side of it. And as you said, controlled anger or controlled response. And I just keep thinking of 2 Corinthians 10 when you're talking, because Paul says to the church there, and I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away, I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness. So his whole point is here, I'm going to act like Jesus in his gentleness and meekness, but I will be bold toward you if I have to. I don't want to.
Yeah.
And so I think that is the other side of it. That's the often ignored other side of meekness and gentleness is, yes, walking into the temple with a whip, throwing over the tables, not out of uncontrolled anger, but because it's the right thing to do and it needs to be done. And so when you see somebody in trouble, you need to snatch them out of the fire, as Jude says. You need to go in there with boldness.
One of the main ways that this word was used in secular Greek writings was to describe a tame animal, like a war horse that has been trained to submit to the leading of the soldier, the warrior that's sitting on it. So if you think of this and you understand that a war horse is a powerful creature, that was, you read the Old Testament especially, you see that horses and chariots were the tanks and the fighter jets of the day. These were instruments of battle.
Fighter jets of gentleness.
Yes, but we are to be the fighter jets of gentleness. There's a title for the episode. We are not powerful for our own purposes. This goes to the self-control conversation we had. Our reins are in the hands of God. Jesus, our Lord, is directing us, and we bring his gentle spirit and we bring his strength under the control and submission to him. And so we have to always be like a war horse in the midst of the chaos of battle, under control, and not just under our own control, but under the Lord's control.
That is the least talked about characteristic, I think, of meekness and gentleness. But anytime we think about meekness and gentleness, I think we immediately go toward like 1 Thessalonians 2:7, as Paul says, we were gentle among you like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. I wouldn't necessarily call a nursing mother a war horse, but it's that other side of that same picture, though. It's gentle.
The point that is emphasized with prautes of a war horse is the sense that they are tamed. You still have beagles, right?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
We have 3.
Yeah, so it's different. How they respond to Ashlyn is different than an untrained or than a wild dog that's been on the loose, that's protecting its territory. There is a gentleness, a friendliness that at the same time would protect Ashlyn. But here's another aspect of gentleness. There's how we treat each other. That's brought up quite a bit. Ephesians 4 talks about treating each other with that spirit of gentleness. And then there's also how we receive the word. So in James 1:21, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. So what do you think it would look like to have the teachable spirit that meekness would provide for us?
Well, I guess it goes again to the war horse or to the trained animal. When you have a dog, you understand that you have to teach them. You have to train them. There is a period where when they're puppies, like they do not care about a word you say, and you really have to go through this process of getting them to listen to your voice, getting them to understand what commands you want to give them and what they need to do. Mm-hmm. And it takes them submitting to the will of their master. And we see that there in James. That's the whole idea, is that I don't want to be in control. I don't want to conquer the world. I don't want to be the one who, through my own power, is wielding my authority. Mm-hmm. I want to wield the authority of God.
Yeah, there's no, how dare you say that to me? You're a hypocrite yourself, and you shouldn't be correcting me in that way, or
how many conversations go that way?
Oh man, or but I'm not that bad, or just rationalizing, justifying, defending ourselves, and that is not the meek way, the way of gently submitting to the will of God. So I have I want to share my favorite example of meekness in the Bible, and it is Moses. Mm-hmm. Moses, who Numbers 12:3 says that Moses was the most humble man, or English Standard says, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth.
I want to see him walking around telling everybody, do you know how meek I am?
Yeah.
Do you know how humble I am?
It's a weird thing whenever Moses seems to be the author of the book of Numbers, and he says of himself he was very meek. But you see him tell the story of how he got to be meek, and it's not always a flattering story.
Right.
You see him in the beginning of his story responding by murdering someone, trying to protect one of his own, but that leads to murder, and that wasn't the right response. That wasn't the meek response. Even though there's strength, there he is lashing out, and he has to run away, and everything falls apart. And so there's kind of the one extreme. To go back to Aristotle, there's the one extreme of maybe flying off the handle and not controlling properly what is the best response here. On the other hand, then you see him for 40 years in the wilderness on Mount Midian, serving as a shepherd, and he's in hiding. He's run away from his job, such that when God comes to him in Exodus 3 and 4 in the burning bush and says, I've got a job for you, he says, no, not me. I'm too weak. I'm not good at it. I'm not the guy you want. So he's lost that backbone and that strength to submit to God's will. To submit to God's will, like the tamed animal, takes a certain kind of strength, and he's missing that. But God teaches him meekness. So he goes and he stands up to the Pharaoh, and he leads the people through as God's representatives through the Red Sea and brings them out. And they're constantly opposing him, whining against him, and yet he's pleading for them, as we talked about in the prayer episode, and saving their life in his intercession to God. And he, in this experience, through the fire of trying to serve God in difficult circumstances, learns meekness, such as there's nobody on the earth who's more meek. And that's a picture of the two extremes that aren't meek, and then how Moses became meek. And so that's good for me to see what I shouldn't be and what I should be as I humbly, gently submit to God in the hard things, courageously, and in the times when I need to be compassionate and soft with the people who are around me, who might, in my mind, deserve to take a beating.
Well, in Moses particularly, I mean, he dealt with a lot from the people, all their complaints, all the trouble that they gave him. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of Ephesians 4, where a lot of these fruit of the Spirit are all tied together in one place there, where Paul says, I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of your calling to which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And you kind of see that in the life of Moses. He was trying to unite the people. He was trying to bring them together. He was trying to lead them in the way that God wanted them to be led. And it took a lot of patience. And it took a lot of love, and it took a lot of gentleness and humility. And that is what he was always trying to do, even though he failed at it a lot of times, and we're going to fail at it a lot of times.
Yeah, Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Whenever we come with this tranquil strength, this gentle power into our lives, and you can see this in people. Yeah. It is one of the most noticeable fruit in mature Christians, one of the most noticeable distinctions that I can see whenever I see a godly, mature saint and contrast them with the world. But what you see is the way they carry themselves is just different.
Right.
And so whenever we bring that gentleness into our lives, there is an effect on all the people and situations around us. It doesn't take away bad things happening, but you can start to see how even in this age, the meek inherit the earth, how this brings about a different kind of success than the world might define, a change in your life circumstances and in the people of God and the congregation of God's people. That is a kind of victory over the forces of darkness.
In the world today, in our society today, the world is so good at retorting back, answering back, fighting back, defending themselves, and standing up for their position in no amount of gentleness, no amount of meekness or respect or kindness. And I think as far down the path our society goes toward being uncivil and completely rude and self-serving, the more and more and more you and I are going to stand out when we quietly, with gentleness and respect, answer for the things that we believe, when we make a defense for the reasons, for the hope that's in us. 1 Peter 3:15. When we do that with gentleness and respect, that is going to shine in this world in a bigger way than it might have otherwise, maybe in decades past. All right, so let's go through the challenge for this week. Find an opportunity. Whatever you're faced with day to day, your mileage may vary on this, but find an opportunity to show gentleness, to be meek, whether that's your response to a server at a restaurant, whether that's your response to somebody who is saying negative things about you, whatever it is. Find an opportunity and make note of it this week where you show gentleness and meekness.
If you're a parent, it'll be easy to find the opportunity.
Oh, I need to write this on a Post-it note and stick it on my mirror. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website at BibleGeeks.fm. Go there, and there's a link at the top of the page to drop us an email if you want to send us any questions or feedback. We'd love to get in touch with you. You can also find us on social media. We are /the Bible Geeks, wherever you might find us. And until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
See ya.